Subcommittee will be in order. Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here to discuss the Department's fiscal 18 budget request. We want to thank you also for your service to your country. And we'd like to thank the big chairman, Frelinghuysen, for being here today with us. I know these issues are very important to him as well. We also want to recognize our distinguished ranking member, Mrs. Lowy. I'm pleased we were able to continue working together as chair and ranking member of this subcommittee. I want the Secretary to know this subcommittee has a history of bipartisanship, and I hope that will continue as we move through the appropriations process for this fiscal year. I know the Secretary has been busy the last couple of days testifying on both the Senate side before two committees and on the House side before two as well. Mr. Secretary, these are, to say the least, challenging times for our country's foreign policy and national security. There are crises at seemingly every corner of the globe. As the nation's top diplomat, I know you're most keenly aware of that. From long-standing challenges such as achieving Middle East peace, ensuring stability in Afghanistan and Pakistan, to maintaining cooperation among our Gulf partners, denuclearizing the Korean Peninsula, tackling drugs, crime, corruption in our own hemisphere, and the critically important task of leading a global coalition to defeat ISIS. You have your work cut out for you. The President's budget request for the Department and Foreign Operations for fiscal 18 is $40.09 billion, which includes $28.8 billion in base funding and $12.01 billion in overseas contingency operations (OCO) funding. In total, that's a cut of 24% from the level included in the fiscal year 017 omnibus under which we now operate. While I support the President's efforts to beef up our military through the defense budget, and we all do, the sweeping cuts proposed to the State Department and our international assistance programs are deeply concerning. Many of us share the views articulated so well in the last couple of days by Admiral Mullen and General Jones in their recent op-ed entitled "Why Foreign Aid is Critical to the U.S. National Security." I appreciate that this budget request fully funds the Memorandum of Understanding with Israel. It's imperative that during such dangerous times in the Middle East, Israel be able to maintain its qualitative military edge. The budget also prioritizes programs that support the campaign to defeat ISIS. But the proposed cuts to security and economic assistance for many of our partners in this fight sends at best a mixed message about our commitment to them and to the fight. I hope you can reassure us today by addressing how the Foreign Military Financing Program and Economic Support and Development Fund will meet the needs of partner countries engaged in defeating ISIS. Although the funding levels are reduced, I'm pleased the request continues to focus on programs that counter Russian aggression. I understand from your statements last week that the President asked you to begin a re-engagement process with Russia. I would also like to tell the subcommittee what that entails, because from where I sit, their actions on so-called areas of mutual interest continue to be problematic. A good example is North Korea, one of the greatest global threats, of course, today. Recent reports indicate Russia has stepped up their economic engagement with North Korea, intending to diminish the impact of China's economic sanctions. I don't have enough time today to go through the list, but with almost every top U.S. security priority, you'll find Russia working against our interests in some manner, not to mention the arrest taking place this week on the streets of Moscow. I've noted many of the ongoing global crises that require diplomatic efforts, but they also underscore the tremendous need for continued investments in humanitarian assistance, democracy promotion, and support for global health and development programs. This budget proposal makes significant cuts in these areas that I believe are contrary to our nation's long history of leading the world in helping the most vulnerable people during times of crises, conflict, and unrest. Mr. Secretary, I hope you can reassure us that keeping U.S. personnel safe while serving abroad is at the top of your priorities. The recent attack in Kabul is a reminder that we must remain ever vigilant in the defense of U.S. personnel and facilities overseas. It will certainly be my first objective as we review your request and move through the appropriations process. I hope you will address how such a challenging task will be achieved with substantially fewer resources. Before I close, I want you to know that I take my role in providing oversight of this department and the many foreign assistance programs very seriously. My first hearing as chair of this subcommittee was with the Inspectors General of State and USAID to identify the most significant management challenges. I'm sure I don't need to tell you there are many, and they're indeed significant. I intend to address this issue further in my questions of you, but I believe they're the Department of State. As you and I have talked briefly really early on about the need for a Deputy Secretary for Management, freeing you and the policymakers of the necessary time required to do the paperwork of running the department. We look to working with you to identify your most pressing needs and to support your efforts to maximize efficiencies and find other cost-saving measures. The taxpayers deserve this level of scrutiny. Fund the federal government, and this subcommittee will hold its responsibility carefully, considering the impact of the President's proposed funding and personnel reductions to state and foreign assistance programs. You have your work cut out for you, and we want to be there to help you in the chores that are important to all of us. Ms. Louie.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Secretary Tillerson, thank you very much for joining us today. During your confirmation hearing, you stated, quote, "Quite simply, we are the only global superpower with the means and the moral compass capable of shaping the world for good. If we do not lead, we risk plunging the world deeper into confusion and danger." I must say I was very moved by this statement as a strong believer that our diplomacy and development efforts are critical to maintaining U.S. global leadership and protecting our national security. But after the dramatic 32% reduction in the fiscal year 2018 International Affairs budget, I am truly struggling to reconcile your remarks with the President's disastrous plan, ironically titled, quote, "A New Foundation for American Greatness," end quote. Slashing development and diplomacy will not put America first. It will put American lives in danger, a fact underscored in a recent letter by 123 and 4-star generals. Additional statements from your confirmation also confuse me. You spoke about your time at Exxon elevated. Those comments do not comport with this budget's elimination of funding for food aid, UNICEF, family planning, development assistance, climate change, programs for vulnerable children, and drastic reductions such as the proposed 53%, and I know you must believe it. This would make Americans less safe by reducing our ability to stabilize regions on the cusp of extremism and to combat epidemics like Ebola. The United States will not maintain our global leadership if we slash our development and diplomacy budgets. By your own admission, the goal is to have other nations fill the gaps left by these cuts, that is, abdicating our role in the world. We should not risk that void being filled by those who oppose our values or interests. You also reference U.S. funding for international family planning as a, quote, important level of support, end quote. And yet your budget would eliminate this funding. With this cut and proposed reductions to maternal and child health, we cannot maintain advances in maternal and child health. Quite simply, under the president's budget, lives that would have been saved will be lost. I'm gravely concerned by this administration's posture towards Russia as well. The budget lists countering Russian aggression as a key priority. Yet, you recently questioned why we should care about Ukraine and proposed cutting assistance by 60% to countries facing Russian threats, including a 70% cut to Ukraine. This budget would abandon our allies and encourage the worst behavior by Russia. Finally, we have heard from faith leaders, heads of businesses, military authorities, foreign policy experts, congressional colleagues on both sides of the aisle who all agree a comprehensive national security strategy is only possible when defense is supported by diplomacy and development. Cutting these critical tools of our foreign policy is a surefire way to put our men and women in uniform in harm's way. I do hope you will explain the administration's strategy behind this budget, because frankly, I'm not sure there is one. I look forward to hearing your testimony. I look forward to working with you, and I look forward to hearing your view of the world and your responsibility of this very, very critical department. Thank you very much.
We are pleased to have with us, Ms. Secretary, the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Frelinghuysen, who's now recognized.
Well, thank you, Chairman Rogers, and Mr. Secretary. Welcome to the appropriations process on the House side. You fill some historic shoes, and we want to wish you the best of luck, and obviously work cooperatively with you. Today's hearing is part of an important part of our oversight duties of this committee. Now that we've formally received the administration's budget request, the committee will be undertaking a thorough analysis. After all, the power of the purse lies in this building. It's the constitutional duty of Congress to make these types of spending decisions on behalf of the people we represent, whether they work here at home or whether they work abroad on our behalf. Mr. Secretary, there are many, as others have said, both the ranking and chair, there are many important programs in the State Department budget that support national security and our ability to influence events in the world. All of us have heard from our colleagues that the State Department, the USAID, AID, Millennium Challenge Corporation, and other agencies are critical to preventing conflict and reducing the need to put our men and women in uniform in harm's way. Mr. Secretary, I'm also pleased, as the chairman noted, to see that our budget, your budget, is focused on the campaign to defeat ISIS al-Qaeda, and other terrorist groups that pose a threat to our country and our allies. Hopefully, your soft power will be able to match our military power and endurance. We're going to try to make that happen. I'm also pleased with my colleagues to see your continued strong support for the State of Israel. That is a very special relationship, and we need to keep it strong. However, many of my colleagues are concerned about the magnitudes of the cuts to the State Department and USAID programs that suggest that America is stepping back from its engagement in the world. I hope that's not the case. I'm sure you'll reassure us that it isn't. Frankly, the world is a better place when we're front and center. We know that events around the world impact the safety of Americans, American businesses, and jobs. Much of the work of the State Department, and may I say, and all of us up here have had the opportunity to interact with your Foreign Service officers. Their work is to be commended. So they indeed are the ones that oftentimes are in a position to shape events that provide stability and diffuses conflict in the countries where they do this type of work. And of course, it's our job on this committee to try and make the right kind of trade-offs in the tight fiscal environment, keeping all of this in mind. And while we're talking about safety and security, and I don't mean to pile on, Mr. Secretary, I have to say I was surprised by the depth of cuts in this budget to embassy security. In a world where our overseas diplomats, and let me commend them and you, our facilities and our citizens pose a temptation to those who seek to do us harm or make a political statement or grab a headline. We must, I think, all agree more to harden these targets from attack. I'm very skeptical about a reduction of 19% that would, in your budget, that relates to that particular account. But once again, Mr. Secretary, we welcome you here. We're looking forward to working with you. I thank the Chairman for the time.
Mr. Secretary, we look forward to your testimony. Your written statement will be put in the record, and we would like for you to summarize it.
Thank you, Chairman Rogers, Ranking Member Lowy, and distinguished members of the committee. I'd like to begin by saying, of course, we were all stunned to learn of this morning's shooting involving your colleague, members of congressional staff, and the Capitol Police. Representative Scalise is a friend of mine, and he represents many friends of mine back in Louisiana. It's painful for me to hear about those that were wounded. I also understand at least one Capitol Police officer was injured in the line of duty. We want to honor those law enforcement members, the emergency medical teams, those who responded for their courage in dealing with the situation quickly. I and my colleagues at the State Department pray for swift recovery for all of those injured. Today, I want to continue the conversation we've started about the administration, State Department, and USAID budget request for fiscal year 2018. As I said to your colleagues on the House Foreign Affairs Committee this morning, I would like to offer a point of view on the Russian sanctions legislation currently being considered by the Congress. I agree with the sentiment that has been conveyed by several members from both parties that Russia must be held accountable for its meddling in the 2016 election. As Congress prepares to vote on the sanctions bill, I would urge the members of Congress to ensure any legislation allows the President, myself, to have the flexibility to adjust any sanctions to meet the needs of what is always an evolving diplomatic situation with the Russians. Essentially, we would ask for the flexibility to turn the heat up when we need to, but also to ensure we have the ability to maintain a constructive dialogue. As we all know, America's global competitive advantages and standing as a leader are under constant challenge. The dedicated men and women of the State Department and USAID carry out the important and often perilous work of advancing America's interest every single day. That mission is unchanged. However, the State Department and USAID, like many other institutions here and around the world, have not evolved in their responsiveness as quickly as new challenges and threats to our national security have changed and are changing. The 21st century already presented many evolving challenges to U.S. national security and economic prosperity. We must develop proactive responses to protect and advance the interest of the American people. With such a broad array of threats facing the United States, the fiscal year 2018 budget request of $37.6 billion aligns with the administration's objectives of making America's security a top priority. While our mission will also be focused on advancing the economic interest of the American people, the State Department's primary focus will be to protect our citizens at home and abroad. Our mission is at all times guided by our longstanding values of freedom, democracy, individual liberty, and human dignity. The conviction of our country's founders is enduring, that all men are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. As a nation, we hold high the aspiration that all will one day experience the freedoms we have known. In our young administration's foreign policy, we are motivated by the conviction that the more we engage with other nations on issues of security and prosperity, the more we will have opportunities to shape the human rights conditions in those nations. History has shown that the United States leaves a footprint of freedom wherever it goes. Ensuring the security and prosperity of the American people and advancing our values has necessitated difficult decisions in other areas of our budget. But even having made hard choices to reduce funding, we will continue to be the leader in international development, global health, democracy and good governance initiatives, and humanitarian efforts. If natural disasters or epidemics strike overseas, America will respond with care and support. I am convinced we can maximize the effectiveness of these programs and continue to offer America's helping hand to the world. This budget request also reflects a commitment to ensure every tax dollar spent is aligned with the Department's and USAID's mission-critical objectives. We believe this budget also represents the interests of the American people, including responsible stewardship of the public's money. I know there's intense interest in prospective State Department and USAID redesign efforts. We have just completed collecting information on our organizational processes and culture through a survey that was made available to every one of our state and USAID colleagues, as well as through individual listening sessions. From this feedback, we have been able to get a clear overall view of our organization. We have no preconceived notions about outcomes, and our discussions of the goals, priorities, and direction of the State Department and USAID are not token exercises. The principles for our listening sessions and subsequent evaluation of our organization are the same as those which I stated in my confirmation hearing for our foreign policy. We will see the world for what it is, be honest with ourselves and the American people, follow facts where they lead us, and hold ourselves and others accountable. We are still analyzing the feedback we've received, and we expect to release the findings of the survey soon. From all of this, one thing is certain. I'm listening to what my people tell me are the challenges facing them and how we can produce a more efficient and effective State Department and USAID. And we'll work as a team with the Congress to improve both organizations. Throughout my career, I have never believed, nor have I ever experienced, that the level of funding devoted to a goal is the most important factor in achieving it. Our budget will never determine our ability to be effective. Our people will. My colleagues at the State Department and USAID are a deep source of inspiration, and their patriotism, professionalism, and willingness to make sacrifices for our country are our greatest resource. I am confident that the U.S. State Department and USAID will continue to deliver results for the American people. I thank you for your time and look forward to your questions.
Mr. Secretary, thank you very much. I understand that you have nominated Eric, is it Uland, as Undersecretary of State for Management, subject to confirmation. He would fill that role. And I think it's terribly important for you to have somebody that's sort of looking after the shop while you're on foreign missions or involved with policy making and the like. Do you not agree with that concept?
Mr. Chairman, I think during this period of time where we're in the evaluation and we're going to undertake the redesign process, it's my intention to be very involved personally in that. You will find throughout my long career in my past life, I am a very hands-on manager, even in the midst of managing a heavy travel schedule and a lot of complex issues. I am bringing in others to assist me with that. I'm interviewing others to come in to help with this redesign effort, so I will have their assistance as well. I would like to ensure that I have full line of sight into all of the aspects of those elements of running the State Department in a very unfiltered way. And I think when we complete the redesign, then we can consider how we want to utilize that position. But today, I would not want someone to come in and just continue what we're doing, because that's not our intent. We have to keep the department running, obviously, but a lot of these processes are right at the heart of what this feedback survey is telling us have to be addressed. So I really want to put my attention and my personal efforts into that. When we have the redesign, then I think it would be timely to consider how that Deputy Secretary of Management can help us with the implementation.
Well, I have confidence, obviously, in your capabilities and because of your experience. Actually, running the State Department is a minor job compared to what you did in the private sector before you came here. I say that halfway facetiously, but only halfway. Mr. Secretary, we have a long history and a good relationship with Colombia, one of our strongest partners in Latin America. Under this committee's leadership in particular, U.S. investments have made a positive difference in the lives of many Colombians, and now they appear to be on a path to peace, which we hope certainly is successful. That being said, Colombia continues to be among the major drug-producing and transit countries in the world. I'm very troubled by the dramatic increase in the level of coca cultivation in Colombia, according to the State Department's own drug report released earlier this year. Colombia saw a 42% increase in illegal coca cultivation from 2014 to 2015. Unofficial estimates expect 2015 and 16 to continue that trend. That's particularly troubling since the DEA reports that 90% of the cocaine in the U.S. is from Colombia. 90%. According to DEA, quote, the United States can expect to see increased cocaine seizures, new cocaine users, cocaine-related deaths, quote. I've seen those results firsthand in my own district, as we all have. Mr. Secretary, in your judgment, does the Colombian government have a credible counter-narcotics strategy, and are they serious about tackling the coca production growth?
In our recent discussions with the Colombian president on his visit, and I had my own opportunity for my bilaterals with them, I think there are some unintended consequences out of the peace plan. And there are a number of elements of the peace plan that cause us some concern, and we're going to continue to engage with them on how the peace plan is ultimately implemented. But to your point of the coca production being up dramatically, one of their explanations to me was that they have a program as part of the peace plan, once it is approved and implemented, that they will be paying farmers who were forced to cultivate coca plants under the FARC. They'll be paying them compensation to convert their fields to other crops. This has led to an unintended overplanting of acreage to coca plants so they can collect more compensation. Now, whether this is all of the reason is not clear to us, but that was one of their explanations, that they made a mistake. What we've said is you have to get back to allowing the spraying of these fields, the destruction of the fields, And whatever is standing in the way of that, which in the past security, as you know, being able to secure areas so people could go in and actually spray these fields because they have to be sprayed largely from the ground. It's difficult terrain to spray them from the air. That we have to get back to eradicating these fields. So we're in direct conversation with them. I would also say, and I can get into it later with you, is we have a new initiative underway between Department of Homeland Security Secretary Kelly and myself, our Mexican counterparts, to take a completely different integrated approach to addressing the supply chain of narcotics to the United States, which deals with where is the supply originating from, whether it's coca plants out of Colombia or it's fentanyl out of China. What is the manufacturing process within Mexico? What is the transportation distribution? What is the marketing and consumption? And we're now addressing that through joint efforts to break this supply chain into components which we will address together. Obviously, supply side in Colombia is going to be extraordinarily important as to our efforts to work with the Colombian government to step up eradication.
Well, I'm glad to see that you're on this in a heavy way, and I appreciate that very much, and we wish you the best in that effort. Ms. Lowy?
Mr. Secretary, in all my years on this subcommittee, I have never seen a budget request that is more of a fundamental retreat from the basic tenets of our foreign policy. This budget is simply insufficient to keep diseases and unrest away from our borders, would fail to provide necessary services on which businesses and American citizens rely. Simply put, the President's America First budget would put Americans at risk. And as the Secretary of State, the chief diplomat, and our face to the world, a couple of questions. If you would explain how would cuts to global health and development funding not jeopardize the progress we are making in saving lives and building a better and more secure world for children and their families? How can the United States, in all good conscience, leave millions of children and their family members vulnerable by denying treatment or preventative interventions? Have you considered the impact of withholding vaccines from millions of children, leaving them at risk from completely preventable illnesses and endangering maternal and child health globally? And by zeroing out family planning and reproductive health programs, how would this budget not, in effect, increase abortions worldwide? Many studies have shown that denying women access to family planning services results in more unintended pregnancies. With your proposed cuts, this would result in millions of unintended children to families with no resources to take care of them. I would appreciate your response.
Well, I think some context first on the total budget itself being down 32%. Recognize we're coming off of a record year in fiscal year 2017. If we look at the budget relative to historic levels on an inflation-adjusted level, we're about at where we would be on an inflation-adjusted level over 15 years. So there's been a tremendous increase in budgetary funds made available to the State Department and USAID over the past roughly 8 years. So in our view, and I think the President's view, is that level is not sustainable given the other priorities that we have. Having said that, now let me speak directly to the impacts in the areas that you've noted, and they are very important areas to us as well. We have a $1 billion reduction to PEPFAR program that I think is widely recognized as among the most successful, and I spoke about it in my confirmation hearing. That will still allow PEPFAR, our programs to address HIV/AIDS, will be maintained at all current treatment levels, all patients in 13 countries that we're currently working in. The focus areas where we think we're winning the war against AIDS, that will be maintained, no reductions there. In terms of new countries, what we're seeking is others to come in and join this fight. Use the PEPFAR model, well-proven, results-driven, and let's apply that in other countries as well. So we do intend to be very active as a convener and also soliciting others to work with us. We've worked very closely with the agencies and the directors that carry out the PEPFAR program, and they feel comfortable they can deliver the current level of care with the budget that the monies that are included in this budget. Secondly, we are fully meeting our 5-year pledge to fully fund Gavi for vaccines. This is the 5th payment of that 5-year plan. We intend to fully meet those obligations to Gavi. There are other areas of the health programs that have had to be curtailed. Again, tough choices, hard choices for us to make. We do have efforts in multiple parts of the State Department USAID activities where we will continue to remain engaged and continue to be interested and continue to attempt to bring other donors, other sources of funding, ask for more pledges from others, including private foundations, but also working with other government and health organizations. We are not stepping away from these very important programs. For all the reasons that you have articulated, we agree with that entirely. This is just some of the tough choices we had to make, but we've been very careful to understand, in the case of PEPFAR and areas like that, what is the impact? We've been very engaged with the people who are delivering these services.
Mr. Chairman, I just want to have one comment in conclusion. I'm pleased that you're reaching out to the private sector. I'm pleased that you're reaching out to foundations. The 2017 budget, of which we are very proud, was a bipartisan effort. The needs in the world for food, for clothing, for water are so great that if you can be successful in reaching out and bringing in additional resources, wouldn't that be exciting? But don't cut the basic needs, and I do hope you will think through this budget seriously and respond to the bipartisan, constructive work we have done. I've been on this committee for over 28 years, and I'm proud of the bipartisan work we've done. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chairman Frelinghuysen.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, in your statement, you said, if natural disasters or epidemics strike overseas, America will respond with care and support. I'm convinced we can maximize the effectiveness of these programs and continue to offer America's helping hand to the world. Please share with the committee some of your ideas for maximizing the effectiveness of some of these programs. Most of us have been on these panels. We've heard about redesigns. We've heard about surveys. I assume you came to the job with some of your own opinions about our delivery system.
Well, yes, I did, from some of my past experiences, all of which we were working towards the same objectives, whether it be trying to defeat malaria through Malaria No More, whether it was through HIV/AIDS programs at PEPFAR, whether it's through food aid. And I think there are, and as we talk to our State Department colleagues, this is where some of this information is coming back to me, that there are well-intended programs that have been appropriated. Sometimes the appropriation construct actually results in a less effective and efficient way to deliver the need. Food aid is one particular area. We believe, our colleagues in the State Department believe, the most effective way and the most efficient way to deliver food aid is through IDA, through the international assistance, rather than through the Food for Peace, which is a well-intended program. But they have told us our experience in comparing those two methods of delivery is clearly IDA is far superior in its speed of delivery, its ability to get the needed aid to people quickly. So we have a number of models within the State Department that will inform us as to what is the best way to do this. And we need to take our own internal learnings and best practices and apply those based upon experience. There are others in the private foundation, private NGO, or the NGO sector, that also have different delivery models that we hear from them. If we could do it this way rather than that, we could be faster, which is going to be more efficient, and we're much more responsive to the needs. So again, through part of this redesign is looking at how do we deliver on mission internally, and then obviously we do this through a lot of partners. But that's going to cause us to look at how our work done, what are the best ways, and our people know. I mean, the people that are down there doing the work are going to tell us what it is, and we hear these examples coming out of these survey work already.
Just one comment. I think you're directly or indirectly complimenting some of the good people beneath you. Whenever we have the privilege of visiting a foreign nation, we meet with the embassy team. And I do think there's a true amount of dedication there, and they really do know they know which programs are effective. So I hope during the survey and redesign process, you talk to some very men and women who've been part of the diplomatic corps for 20 years to seek out their ideas as to how we can best spend, if there's less money, how we can spend it more effectively.
That was a direct compliment, but more importantly, it was a direct recognition. We know where the expertise lies within the State Department. It is the people who are delivering, and that was the intent. And again, that's the information of the survey. The survey was designed to have our people tell us what is getting in your way, your ability to do this. We are going to have also former Foreign Service officers, some former ambassadors are going to be engaged in this redesign process, so we take advantage of people who have years of experience dealing with this.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Lee.
Thank you very much. Good to see you, Mr. Secretary. Thank you for being here. I, too, am really quite shocked at this budget. I've been on this committee a while, prior to this Foreign Affairs Committee, and I have to just go back to Secretary Mathis' quote, Secretary of Defense. He said, if you don't fund the State Department fully, then I need to buy more ammunition ultimately. Now, I assume this $54 billion increase in defense and the 30% reduction in your budget means that we're getting ready for more ammunition purchases and for wars. And so I'm just really quite dismayed to see this, given your statements and your history. Let me just go right to the HIV, AIDS, PEPFAR, and Global Fund cuts. This is outrageous. First of all, I understand, and I'm happy to hear you say that we're going to maintain the treatment for patients. But I don't know if you're aware of this, but there will be approximately new infections, people who will need treatment throughout the world, 280,100 people. This is just outrageous that we're not looking at the new infections, the preventive nature of what PEPFAR has done. We're trying to get to a world where we know, and the UN has said, that we can see an AIDS-free generation. We're losing now with this budget. We're going backwards. We're going to lose the progress that we've made. I'm not sure if you know the history of PEPFAR, just very briefly. It was myself and the Congressional Black Caucus that took this to President Bush. President Bush, Democrats, Republicans, all of us, led by the Congressional Black Caucus, we worked on PEPFAR, and we've worked together in a bipartisan way up until now. And so I just can't understand why in the world we would cut funding, maintain flat funding, if we risk this epidemic spiraling out of control. While I'm very pleased to hear that people aren't going to be cut from treatment, what are we going to do about these hundreds of thousands of new infections and people who are looking to us, not to other countries, not to the private sector, but to us to lead and to bring other countries together? But I know for a fact that countries are not going to put up any funding unless we lead in that. And by us cutting, naturally that gives everyone else an out.
Well, as I indicated, we're going to continue to lead. At $5 billion, we are still leading. And I think when we talk to the folks that are managing PEPFAR, again, maintaining the treatment of all current clients and patients, some of those will move off of the rolls as their disease moves to a different stage, and we will accommodate new treatments as they move off, and that is their expectation within our 13 focus countries. There obviously, as you well, I know you know the subject quite well, and I know it reasonably well. There is a need to have these programs in other countries that we're not present in today. We're going to continue our efforts in this area, working with others, and again, to attempt to attract governments, other governments, as well as other NGO foundations and whatnot, to take the program into countries that are currently not served. We have countries today that are not served under the past program. But I want to, at this level, we continue to be the leader, and I think therefore it gives us convening authority as well as asking authority of people. We are doing a lot. If you look at the history of how much the American people have done in this regard, it's something to be very proud of, and we're very proud of it. So I don't want to indicate to you in any way that we've lost our commitment to continuing to fight this battle, because we do. I think many of the health professionals believe we are turning the tide.
Mr. Secretary, but we can't do this with a $470 million cut to PEPFAR and $225 million cut to the Global Fund and eliminating the bilateral HIV/AIDS funding at USAID. We just can't do that. And I know the experts and I know people in the field. They're worried about this because they know good and well that we won't be able to bring people onto treatment. And with new infections, we can't do our prevention now. And with the projected numbers of new infections, this budget is just not going to get it. And believe you me, the rest of the world is looking to us to lead. They won't step up unless we step up. And we know we can achieve an AIDS-free generation by 2030, but we can't do that if we back off now, Mr. Secretary. And so I would hope that you would reconsider this and really look at the history of this. And finally, in the few minutes that I have left, I just want to see, in terms of the cuts to the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, which is charged with upholding human rights abroad, given what's taking place in Chechnya against LGBT individuals, you know, gay men, it's outrageous. How are we going to address human rights if, in fact, we're cutting the budget at this level?
Well, it takes a lot of advocacy and it takes a lot of engagement with those countries where these atrocities are occurring. As I indicated with Russia, we have quite a large number of issues on our table between us, and this is one of them. We're going to work through these issues in a hopefully a way in which we can make progress, but I would tell you it's early stages in our engagement with Russia. The past 4 years of no engagement has us starting with a lot of issues on the table.
Chairman Granger.
Mr. Secretary.
Thank you, and thank you for being here. Thank you for the job you're doing. You said at the beginning that you listen to people, and I think that's important. It's also important to listen to the Congress. We're your friends. We've done this for years, and I called you over 4 weeks ago, never a call back, no one from your staff, nothing, and all I was doing is offering my help. I now chair Defense Subcommittee. I did chair this subcommittee for 6 years, and I think these two, the members of these subcommittees are the best you can find. They care for what they're doing. They have been involved for years, and we are dealing with very important issues. So I'd ask you and the administration to look at us as friends and help. I have two specific concerns that sort of they're just like this. They're helping us, Jordan specifically, I'd say. You couldn't ask for a better partner. If we do go different ways, then, for instance, cut to foreign military financing. Mrs. Lowy asked a question, so if we cut that, who does it? How many countries go to Russia? How many countries go to China? There's a cost there, and it's not a dollar cost, it's a cost in lives. So I'd say, you know, what is the plan to that? And are you really considering it seriously? And then I have one more question when you answer that, or I'll ask.
About $700 million. We're fully meeting our commitments to Israel, fully meeting our commitment to Egypt, to Jordan, and to Pakistan in those 4 countries where we have made prior commitments. That leaves us about $200 million that we can utilize with other countries for FMF. OMB has asked us to look at other ways to support countries, foreign military finance, including where countries have the capacity to consider loan guarantee structures. But I also would want to make sure you understand that Secretary Mattis and myself have also set up a process where we have our staffs. He has he has a part of his budget, and we're not trying to supplant our budget with his, but there are some areas that are closely aligned to our same objectives in certain countries, where if we are ensuring we're coordinating their budgets with ours, we think we can still meet a lot of the objectives of our foreign military financing. You are exactly correct. When we are not able or unwilling to enable purchases of arms from the United States, people are going to shop elsewhere, and we see the peddlers of arms from other countries appearing as well. We're very mindful of that. The President's very mindful of it. So I think we're being asked to try some different approaches with countries. Let's see if we can't maintain meeting the needs with a little less money. It's, as I say, it's about $700 million is the difference.
My second question has to do with the rumors. Of course, this is a great place for great rumors, but there are programs that have been funded through State Department that will be turned to DOD, to Defense. As Chair of Defense, I would ask you to look at that and always know that we're trying to rebuild a military that has been cut year after year after year until until finally those people that lead the military said, we're finally telling you we can't do the job we're asked to do with this sort of money. I would ask you to be very mindful of that in moving any extra new programs into defense.
Well, and that is certainly not what we have underway. So if you have a specific, I'd appreciate your staff letting us know if they're hearing that something's going on. Secretary Mattis and I have a very open and close communication on a weekly and every other day basis. And we've been working this particular issue of how we ensure our funding in areas that is complementary to theirs and theirs is complementary to ours, how we coordinate that. And there's no intention of transferring programs. We have suggested that the DOD programs, and this has been the practice in the past when Congress has authorized those, that those programs that defense is carrying out require State Department
national security, but working on a lot of these other issues too. I know that the questions that were asked yesterday by the Senate and telling you that these deep cuts will hurt us, and they will. You know, you have a lot of experience, and I'm glad you where you are. Hopefully you will use that experience to what's, and I know this is your intent on what's right for America, not the political side. But the fact that you have managed one of the top corporations in the world, you know management. I think it's great that you're reaching out to employees on, what do you call it, redesign program. That's very important. But I think right now, you know budgeting too. Budgeting is about priorities. And there's a lot we have to do. And if you can bring money in from the private sector, that's fine. If you can save money, that's fine. But I think one of the things that I'm very concerned about, and just in the last month or so, I probably have been to about 10 different countries: Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen, you know, a lot of these different areas. And when you came into office for the Trump administration, the morale, and every time we go to another country with your people out in the field, is not good at all. Now, that's not unusual when a new boss comes in, you read it. But what you see now, you see many positions that haven't been filled. You see individuals who are really career people, just like our intel people, our military people that are throughout the world on a regular basis out on our behalf. And when the morale's bad, that's difficult. Now, they're not going to tell the top boss that. But, you know, I really hope, and based on your experience, that you understand and see where the problems are. Now, I'm not going to quote Mattis again, because I will quote him, but not the quote that has been used. The quote that I have is he talks about extremism, and he basically has said that, I even lost the quote. Where did I put it? I'll get back to it. Oh, that extremism is because of lack of opportunity in these countries, insecurity, injustice, and hopelessness. And, you know, this is part of what the soft power does, the State Department. I'm asking you, and this concerns me because we love America, we're patriotic people, and forget the Democratic-Republican issue. It's about the United States of America, who is the best country in the world. But when we pull back, when we don't go on our budgeting and what you're doing, it gives China the ability to be the more powerful person in the world and take a position that we are. We're pulling back. It gives, what I'm seeing from my point of view, it gives Putin the ability to get whatever he wants. You know, and I am glad you're communicating with him. That's fine. And you don't get places if you don't. But the fact that everything that we do and the way we've treated our European allies and some of the things that we've said, that really hurts our relationship. When the Chancellor of Germany says we'll deal with China now instead of the United States, I hope you can fix that, by the way. And that's important in all these different areas. And really, my question is, do you see what we're seeing from where we are? And those of us who've been here for a while and have this experience, not only in national security and what Chairman Granger said, I agree with 100%. You know, that we have the experience. You're in a powerful position. We want to work with you. I think you've got everything it takes to do it. I'm glad you decided to do this for your country. Where do you see, but this budgeting, but remember, budgeting is about priority. Where do you see this putting us when we are pulling back and some of the things that people have said? Where do you see us as it relates to Russia and China and losing our power in the world? And the final thing I want to say, you had to, every quarter, you had to produce monies for your corporation. The government's different. I mean, some of the decisions that are made here will be 15, 20 years out. And that is a big difference as far as some of the roles. Accountability, all of that, that's fine. So if you could answer the question about, I'm worried about losing our power and our ability and our reputation throughout the world with our allies first, but then the world generally.
I think the best way for me to perhaps try to address that is to give you what was my assessment of how I found U.S. relations around the world in my first month as Secretary of State. But I will tell you, it is informed by the fact that in my old life, I was very engaged with these same leaders and would just listen to them talk about the relationship with the U.S. and where I think it is today, and recognizing that that relationship that I walked into as Secretary of State was defined by 4 years of very high spending levels in the State Department. And I would tell you the relationships were not good. They were not good in Europe. They were not good in the Middle East. They were not good in Southeast Asia. And the reason they were not good is there was an absence of engagement. There was an absence of decisive engagement. And I heard this from them over and over and over. We are not pulling back in any way from our engagement with our allies. Rather, we are leaning into the engagement. And I think while our conversations with them are frank, sometimes they're blunt, and sometimes they're brutally honest, what I am hearing is they are glad we're back having these conversations. They appreciate the decisiveness of this administration. Even if they don't agree with some of the decisions, and they don't, at least it is clear where we are, and we are engaged. We are more engaged diplomatically, they tell me, than we have been in quite some time. And I can tell you, when I heard from the ASEAN countries, and I've had 2 ministerials with all the ASEAN countries, that was the message, that because you were gone for several years, China, to your point, China has moved in. Please, you have to help us push back. We are re-engaging with ASEAN.
I know my time is up now. I do want to say the thing about the people. You know, as a leader in the corporate world, you're only as good as your team. There are big morale problems there, and I hope you can focus and address that. These, especially the people throughout the world that are transferred every 3 years to other areas of the country.
Mr. Diaz-Balart.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Secretary. First, thanks for your willingness to serve. You were already asked something about Colombia, and I just want to kind of go there again. I don't have to tell you that we spent a lot of money in Plan Colombia, and it was highly successful. And production of coca went down to 50,000 hectares. Unfortunately, after the negotiations with the FARC, as you know, that has skyrocketed to 159,000 hectares of coca production. This committee, led by the chairman and the chairwoman, put language in the 27 bill, which in essence has some strings to make sure that we are incentivizing our friends in Colombia to lower production of coca. Your thoughts about the concept of making sure, too, that we do what we can to make sure that that continues, number one, and number two, to make sure that money does not go to members of the terrorist organization FARC?
Well, we have, as I said, we've had discussions with the Colombian leadership, with President Santos, and questioned why, how could this happen? How could this be that we're now in a peace process and everything explodes on us. And so I shared with you one of their explanations. So we are going to continue to press them to, and if they need our assistance to go in and eradicate these fields, we must begin that process now.
I'm glad to hear that, and I think we share that that attitude. This committee shares that attitude with you. Let me shift to Venezuela for a second. And Venezuela, by the way, I'm exceedingly pleased by the sanctions that this administration, very young administration, has imposed on some, frankly, problematic folks, including the so-called vice president, who is a narco kingpin, as has been noted by the administration, as well as the members of the court that, in essence, tried to eliminate the elected members of Congress. Could you please explain how, because the president's budget obviously is silent on programs that support democracy in these regions, so your thoughts about how the Department of State intends to support pro-democracy movements, opposition, et cetera, in places such as Venezuela?
With respect to Venezuela specifically, as you well know, it is extremely challenging there right now. I think we have made some important and significant progress within the OAS. We're going to continue to use the OAS as a vehicle to advance pressure on the regime to return to its constitution, return to its called-for elections. But we also have to work with the opposition to help the opposition become unified. That has been one of the great challenges of the past, is the opposition can't seem to be of one voice. We are also convening with others. We've had conversations with the Vatican. We've had conversations with other countries. Mexico, in particular, is ready to take a lead on some of these issues, because our view is, as you would know as better than I, Maduro uses America's interventions as a propaganda tool in his local campaign. So I think when it comes to Venezuela, we have to find out how we are effective, but be fairly low-key about it and working through other organizations, and that's the approach we're taking. Throughout the region, though, in terms of how we strengthen democracy, strengthen anti-corruption, rule of law, it is our efforts within the Triangle area, in particular of Latin America. We are going to be coming out. I think the President has plans to make a statement about his policies on Cuba as well. So we're working with Argentina, we're working with Brazil in ways that we strengthen in Argentina their emergence from that long period of socialism and Peronist rule. With Brazil, it's how do we stabilize the situation there. So we have an engagement in each of those important countries to speak to what the most pressing need is. And in particular, in the Triangle area, we know we've made some gains. We've got a lot of work to do, but we are making gains on anti-corruption, strengthening the courts, strengthening the power of attorney generals. We want to continue that. So we're directing the resources we have are driven by where we can make the most impact and driven by where we believe we can show results from those.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Secretary, on Colombia and the eradication of coca and the like, wasn't it a part of the agreement with FARC that brought about the peace process to stop eradicating? Wasn't that part of the deal?
I'd have to look at the specific language, Chairman. I can get back to you on that. As you recall, and I know you know the history there was a peace plan that was rejected when it was put to a referendum among the people. It was modified and then agreed and approved by the Congress without taking it to the people. I think there's a reason the people rejected it. It had some problematic areas to it. It still does have some problematic areas around ensuring that those who have committed certain crimes, in particular crimes against humanity, not be given a free pass. So there are some human rights issues we're concerned with in terms of the programs to eradicate the coca fields. That is something that our law enforcement people are looking at and working with them on.
My understanding is
They indicated to us their commitment to undertake the eradication. Now, the way they do that is it is an arrangement where they essentially buy out so to speak, these farmers that allege they were coerced, they were forced by the FARC to plant these coca fields. Now, again, what happened is during the peace process, they tell me people went out and put more fields under cultivation to get to increase their buyout.
Well, we've seen buyouts don't work anywhere in the world, including the U.S. But the fact is that the peace process, peace agreement, included provisions that FARC demanded, and that is to no longer eradicate and spray. And so, in the meantime, 90% of the coca is coming out of that country, and it's growing every day.
Yeah, it's regrettable that efforts and a lot of money put into Colombia by the U.S. brings us to this point. So we've got to work with the Colombian government to resolve this coca problem, but we've got other issues we need to resolve with them as well. And I think I would just tell you, we're at a challenged place with them right now, but we don't want to abandon what has been achieved, and we certainly don't want to send it back into a conflict situation.
And certainly the Plan Colombia has been a smashing success, and we want to see that continue. Ms. Ming?
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here. I have a question about the Office of the U.S. Special Envoy to monitor and combat anti-Semitism. We have written a bipartisan letter and made repeated calls for Congress, from Congress, for you to fill this seat. By what date do you know if you will have appointed a new special envoy to monitor and combat anti-Semitism?
Well, I'm sure, as you're aware, we have, I think when I walked into the State Department, I think we have over 70 special envoys, special representatives, special ambassadors. One of the things that we are considering, and we understand why they were created and the good intentions behind why they were created, but one of the things we want to understand is by doing that, did we actually weaken our attention to those issues? Because the expertise for a lot of these areas lies within the bureaus, and now we've stripped it out of the bureau. And one of the questions I've asked is, if we're really going to affect these areas, that these special areas, don't we have to affect it through the delivery on mission at every level, at every country? And by having a special person, an envoy out here, one of my experiences is, mission then says, oh, well, we got somebody else that does that. And then they stop doing it. And so it was not the intent. I know the intent was to bring more attention to it, but I'm back to how do we deliver on mission? How does this actually get done? And when we examine some of these roles, what we really find is we've diminished the delivery on that issue in every country because people don't think that's part of their mission anymore. It's somebody else's mission. This is some of the confusion that we're getting out of the listening survey. We're hearing confusion around, what's the mission, who owns it, and so right now we're kind of holding on these things until we can understand and again get back to redesign. Those that are mandated by statute, we will be back to talk with you about those as to whether we think it's good to have it structured that way or whether we really think we can be more effective on those issues in a different way. So this will be a conversation for us to have, and we fully intend to grapple with the issue in discussion with the members of Congress.
I was under the impression that the State Department was going to fill the position. This position, as you know, is legislation sponsored by Congressman Chris Smith from New Jersey and signed into law by President Bush. This is an office that previously had a website which would have reports that helps our country keep tabs on global anti-Semitism and advises other countries on how to combat anti-Semitism. So we, in a bipartisan way, are very concerned that there is no office to accomplish this. This is mandated by law. In the United States, there have been, in recent times, over 100 bomb threats to Jewish community centers in both Republican and Democratic districts. So it is something that we are all very concerned about, and hope that you will keep this office and commitment. Is it your position that a special envoy to combat anti-Semitism is not necessary?
No, as I said, we've made no determination on that. I think on the offices that are statutorily mandated and have a statutory requirement for certain activities, those are being met. We haven't pulled staffs out. We haven't made changes in that regard. But as some of the appointees have moved out because they were political appointees, I've made the decision that until we can determine that this is one that we know this is the best way to deliver, we're just taking a pause until we can understand, is this really the best way to meet the intent of the statute? And it may very well be. And so I don't want you to leave this discussion thinking I have not made a decision as to whether I think that particular special envoy office should be left just like it is, or whether there's a better way to deliver on the intent.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, Mr. Secretary. Just a couple things. When President George W. Bush was in office, he and his people often talked about a national security strategy that was three-headed: diplomacy, defense, development. I shared that view. I think that's important. In my view, this budget seems a bit too focused on hard power, not enough on soft power and the tools that you have in the development and diplomacy realms. And I'd just be curious to get your perspectives on that. And as you think about that, I just want you to know, too, I returned from Germany recently on a delegation. And I think you need to be aware that there is a perception, at least in Europe, I'm not saying elsewhere, but in Europe, that there is a loss of American leadership on issues like NATO and security issues to trade and even to the environment, and that they see a lot of political uncertainty over here, and they might even use the term instability. And it's, I think it's frightening to a lot of people in Europe. And my view is that in Europe, they like to, in Europe, they expect an American security guarantee, and you're right to insist on the 2%, but they also reserve the right to complain about us. But they need our leadership, and I think they're scared because we're the rock they could always count on. And I just want you to be aware of that, and I'd just be curious your reaction to that.
Well, I think the model you described from President Bush's era is one that I too believe is an appropriate approach. And I think in this particular budget, my observation is I think what the president is doing is he's catching up on the strength, the hard power side of that three-legged balance. In his view, there's been a certain neglect to maintaining our force posture in our military, in particular in some parts of the Pacific region where we see the rise of China. And so I think the president has decided he's going to address that element of it first, but in doing that, does not want to do that in a way that contributes to the deficit. So tough choices were made. And that's why I think what we've been asked to do is execute on the other two elements of that, along with there are other agencies, obviously, that execute on elements of diplomacy and economic development as well. It's not only the State Department that has resources, anyway, to advance those initiatives. So we know we've been given a challenge, and the approach we've taken is how do we deliver on mission with the resources we have available to us? And that's why I say our intent is not a discontinuance of anything, but to manage across a period of change. And a period of change from a budgetary standpoint and a budgetary priority from last year or the last few years to this year and perhaps the next couple of years. And that's why it's so important to me that we look at how we do this and use this as an opportunity to challenge ourselves as to how we can still deliver on mission.
Understood. And I just wanted to share one other thing, too, on cultural exchange programs, something that's important. It's a 55% cut, and I'm familiar with one of them, the Congress Bundestag Youth Exchange Program, $4 million. We invest in that The Germans invest in it. The highest levels of that government will talk to me about it and say it's important. They participated in it. And I think when we make these kinds of cuts, we have to think about not only our investment, but others who are investing in the same types of programs, particularly allies, and particularly when there's relatively small numbers of dollars and, multi-billion-dollar budgets. I think we have to be a little bit more nuanced and precise because I think it sends a message. For a relatively small amount of money, it sends a bad message. And I just wanted you to hear that, particularly on some of these cultural exchange programs. In that case, we're talking about former enemies who are now great allies. So any thoughts on cultural exchange?
Well, I think, clearly, and not just in allies, but even as we're trying to develop relationships with adversaries to give us the ability to talk to one another and to understand one another, these type of cultural people-to-people programs are very important. And economic, I've said for many, many years, the best diplomatic tool really is economic development and economic relations between countries, because as people can tie their own economic well-being to this other nation and they see benefits of those relationships, that strengthens the understanding of the population of one another. The cultural exchanges only help strengthen that.
I see my time has expired, and I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Mr. Secretary, good to have you here. I want to address with you development and governance support. And I come at this from years as the chairman and ranking member of the House Democracy Partnership, a bipartisan commission that engages parliament to parliament, staff to staff, in strengthening parliamentary capacity in developing countries. Have a close collaborative relationship with USAID and its contractors, such as the International Republican Institute, the National Democratic Institute, RTI International. We've seen democratic practices improve in countries that are severely challenged by financial and political hardship and conflict. We're convinced that fights waged within the confines of Parliament are often fights taken off the street. I know you share that conviction. I'm very pleased that Mark Green, Ambassador Mark Green, has been nominated to head USAID. He's led IRI very ably in recent years. Take that as a positive sign for the future of international development and that agency. Now, in terms of your budget, it's hard to interpret exactly what is in store for governance support, because you've merged these categories of aid: Economic Support Fund, Development Assistance Account, Assistance to Europe, Eurasia, and Central Asia, among other accounts. But the news clearly isn't good, because the overall cuts, reducing economic development assistance, as best we can sum them up, and that includes democracy and governance programs, the overall reduction is something like 40%. And then you add to that severe reductions or elimination of aid for specific countries, many of which are countries we work with quite directly. I'll just give you a couple of examples and ask you to respond. You define as low priority a number of countries that have made great strides. That doesn't mean they've arrived. It doesn't mean they've graduated. In fact, it means that they may be quite fragile and in need of the kind of support, often relatively modest support, that can help them make the transition to full-fledged, flourishing democracies. Sri Lanka is a good example. Now, why on earth would we decrease overall assistance to Sri Lanka by 99%? Sri Lanka is a country that has had years of civil war, years of autocratic government. They finally got a coalition government. They've resolved their longstanding civil war. They're trying to put this negative past behind them. We're faced with heavy Chinese investment in the country. They're in a make-or-break situation. That's why HDP is engaging with them. In fact, has moved very quickly to engage with them. What are you thinking in dropping Sri Lanka from support? And a couple other quick examples. Eastern Europe, countries aspiring to positive economic and political ties to the West, facing hostile Russian opposition every step of the way. This budget cuts Ukraine's economic and development assistance by 73%, total assistance by 69%. Big cuts to Georgia, Moldova, countries similarly situated. And finally, in the Middle East, Lebanon, a complicated and fragile democracy, a linchpin of the Middle East. Economic and development assistance is significantly cut. Overall funding cut by more than half. Tunisia, the one success story from the Arab Spring. We're engaging with Tunisia. We think you should be, that our government overall should be, but yet you're proposing a funding cut of 62%. And by the way, you mentioned the Northern Triangle in Central America. I don't know what you mean by citing support for that, because there, the budget proposes to cut Central America's Northern Triangle countries by 39%. So can you please help me understand this?
First, we worked with the bureaus for them to prioritize where they felt our greatest area of influence and needs are. But let me just talk generally as you go through that list of cuts. These are tough choices. They were not easy choices for the bureaus to make, but we are not disengaging. When you say we're leaving, we're quitting, that's not true. Yes, we don't have as much funding. Perhaps we cannot bring the same level of aid or assistance, but our presence is not going to be diminished. And that's why we're taking different approaches on the Triangle area, and I mentioned the effort there. We're hosting a day-and-a-half conference jointly with the Mexican government in Miami tomorrow and Friday, bringing the Inter-American Bank, bringing the World Bank, bringing private investors to promote economic investment and development in these countries, and a half a day on security and law enforcement to continue to strengthen the role of anti-corruption, the attorney generals, the ability to prosecute, rule of law. None of that is going to end. We may not be able to offer the same level of direct program of diplomatic capability is not going to go away. And so it just means that we can't come with some of the tools we've had in the past, but it doesn't mean we're not coming at all.
Mr. Fortenberry?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, welcome. We appreciate your willingness to be here with us today. Gleaning some key findings from your testimony, I think you are saying that you want to create a 21st century architecture for diplomatic relations and foreign assistance. And secondly, that perhaps more money does not equate to better outcomes. And third is, and I think this is very important because there's a misperception in this regard, that there is going to be authentic engagement. And I think that is absolutely necessary in this complex time, that we lean into these difficulties. And I agree with you that more money does not necessarily mean better outcomes. However, we always have to wrestle with these tensions, because it's been said here that we are looking for the proper synthesis of strong defense and smart diplomacy and sustainable development so that we can create the conditions in which other people have stability and we have security, and we can benefit from all of this exchange. I think that's the goal mutually shared here by everyone. So we want to aggressively wrestle with you as to where those right balances are. Three specific things I'd like to ask you about. With the commitment to eradicating ISIS and the horror that they have caused, particularly the genocide against Christians and Yazidis and other religious minorities, and the people they've killed the most, of course, are innocent Muslims. With the fall of Mosul quickly coming, I think it's important to quickly move toward what the administration has stated as a potential option: interim zones of stability, one of which could be the Nineveh Plain, which used to be a pluralistic area of Iraq where multiple ethnicity or multiple religious traditions live side by side. This has implications for migration as well, as 3+ million people in that area have been displaced. Where will they go? If, in coordination with the Iraqi central government and the Kurdistan central government, that we can create the security situation, integrating potential Christians, Yazidis, and others into military structures there so they can create the conditions for stability, maybe people can return home and recreate the pluralistic tradition in that ancient area. Because without that, the Middle East has no hope. We will lose the basis for any type of stabilization in society as a whole. Second, I want to ask you about the International Atomic Energy Agency and the commitment that you have to break that impasse. Finally, as well, I want to talk to you about Egypt. The administration is engaged, I think, in a very appropriate effort to replenish the relationship with Egypt. We forget that there is a peace accord that has held. There is a roadmap for peace in the Middle East. It's between Egypt and Israel. The current president of Egypt has made some very courageous statements about minority rights, protecting religious pluralism, as well as trying to show leadership on the international stage. Anything that I think we can do to affirm that relationship, and of course, then have the authentic friendship to be able to discuss hard things regarding human rights and the rest, I think is a very important priority to help restore Egypt's central role in creating conditions for stability in the Middle East.
Let me try to comment quickly on the de-ISIS campaign, and you mentioned Mosul. The State Department, working with USAID, the United Nations, and other aid agencies, has a model of approach as the military, and we work this very closely with Secretary Mattis, General Dunford, and our military forces on the ground. As they clear and liberate areas, our role is to come quickly behind with security, law enforcement, using local forces that are trusted by local people to recontact the previous governance of that area. Many of these people fled ahead of ISIS. They're in Turkey. They're in other places. Find them, bring them back so they are ready to resume governance, and then to quickly restore basic needs, power, water, hospitals, schools. After East Mosul was liberated some weeks ago, we already have achieved all of those. We have 40,000 children back in school at East Mosul today. It's to create the conditions so that people that fled this huge refugee problem we have, they want to come back.
Does that include minority populations, though?
It includes all. Now, I would tell you, encouraging minority populations to come back after the terrible atrocities that they suffered is challenging. And I think it's going to take time for them to see that the area really is stable. It really is under the control of people who will not harm them. So this is a confidence trust issue with a lot of the minority populations, in particular, which we recognize. Prime Minister Abadi recognizes it. That part, it will be a slow process, but that is the objective. We have Sunni nations now in the Gulf are engaged directly with Sunni areas of Iraq. They previously would not engage. You may have seen the Foreign Minister of Saudi Arabia made a historic visit to Baghdad. The Prime Minister of Iraq is going to make a historic visit to Riyadh and to Bahrain. This is all of our effort to say to the GCC countries, you must help us secure the future of Iraq. Deal with your Sunni populations and support the restoration, the rehabilitation, humanitarian aid. We will work with Kurds and others on the Kurdish areas. We'll work with the Arab Shia within Iraq. They are all Iraqis. They're Iraqis first. So we're working Iraq very hard. On the IAEA and our international organizations budget, you see the reduction that's been taken there. We're working through how to actually allocate that across international organizations. We've not come to a final decision other than, I would tell you, right now our intention is to fully fund the IAEA for the reasons that you have described. And on Egypt, we have a lot of work to do with Egypt on improving the human rights situation. We were extremely disappointed by the recent legislation that President Sisi signed regarding NGO registration and preventing certain NGOs from operating. We're in discussions with them about how that is harmful to the way forward.
Mr. Stewart.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Tillerson, thank you for being here. This isn't the first one of these you've done this week, I don't suppose, and it's probably not your last, but we do appreciate your time and thank you for your service. I'd like to talk about generally kind of a broad question and then bore down on that just a little bit. I spent a little bit of time in China. I was there a number of times over the last few years. I asked President Xi and Premier Li and others respond to this idea, and I don't speak Greek, so you'll forgive me if I mispronounce this, but it's a theory that I'm sure you're familiar with, the Thucydides theory of that if you have a rising empire and an established empire, that history shows that almost inevitably they come into conflict. And I think that's a fair description of us and our relationship with China at this point. We have been the established superpower for several generations right now. I don't think we can deny that China is a rising power. There's a lot of people, a lot of economic power behind them, and now a very powerful military. So 2 questions for you. First is, would you kind of give us your thoughts on that, on how because the last thing any of us want is any conflict with China. It's clearly not in our interest. It's clearly not in their interest. History shows that it's a very, very difficult thing to maneuver through, where you have these 2 superpowers, or what will be superpowers, with very different interests. And if I could, as I said, bore down just a little bit and give an example of that. And sitting on the Intel Committee, there's a lot of things we're concerned about. China is a very strategic concern. But I tell you one thing that bothers me a lot is their exploitation and from an environmental impact to a military consideration of South China Sea. And as you've commented on a number of times, them building up these atolls that are nothing but a piece of sand hardly out in the middle of the ocean, and now militarizing them. And in fact, in your written testimony, you talk about China's artificial island construction and militarization of facilities, and that is a threat to regional stability, and by extension, a threat to our stability. I'm interested in your thoughts on those 2 ideas, if you would.
The U.S.-China relationship has been defined for the last 50 years with Nixon's historic visit to China, the establishment of the One China policy, which really created the conditions for there to be no conflict. And it has worked. For 50 years, we've had no conflict with the Chinese. It created the conditions for China's economic growth, which we have benefited from. As you know, 500 million Chinese have moved out of poverty into middle-class status. They've moved to the coastlines. There are 1 billion more that want to achieve that same status. And our discussions with the Chinese at the highest levels, and these are the conversations that I have with them at the highest levels, we recognize that China's economic growth has now put them in the position of the rising power. They recognize it. And we cannot constrain their economic growth. We have to accommodate their economic growth. But as their economic growth then translates into spheres of influence that then begin to threaten our national security, this begins to disrupt these conditions that have allowed us to live without conflict for the past 50 years. We are at an inflection point in the U.S.-China relationship for this reason. China has now risen to a point that we are approaching this inflection that you're referring to. They see it, we see it. Our conversations are around how are we going to maintain stability and a relationship of no conflict between China and the United States for the next 50 years. So we're not talking about what happens next year. We're not talking about what happens 4 years, 5 years from now. We're in conversations with them about how will we define this relationship for the next half century, recognizing that dynamics are underway. The Chinese have significant internal challenges of their own with their own people. As their people rise in income level and prosperity, move to the coast, the culture of China is changing, and they know that. That creates challenges for them. So we're on a dialogue with them and a journey with them to decide how do we live with one another the next half century and not come into conflict with one another. These are the nature of our discussions.
Sir, if you could, and I appreciate that, and there's so much I would add to that, but can you talk briefly about the South China Sea, the militarization of those islands there, and our response to that?
There are 3 areas of particular emphasis where we're working together. One is addressing North Korea, where North Korea has historically been an ally to China. We now define North Korea, and I think they are coming around to the notion that North Korea is a liability to China. The South China Sea island building and militarization of the islands is, we have told them, you are creating instability throughout the Pacific region that will bring us into conflict. Please don't do that. Now, how do we want to deal with that? And we're dealing with it regionally by strengthening our alliances with other countries that are being impacted by the island building and the militarization in particular. And then lastly is the economic rise. And what we have said to ourselves in our policy is, as important as trade is and as important as China's huge economy is, we cannot allow China to use that as a weapon We kind of allow them to weaponize trade, and they are doing that today. And our message to them is you will not buy your way out of these other difficult issues like North Korea, South China Sea with your trade.
Thank you. Thank you for that clarity. And Mr.
Time of the
Chairman, I yield
gentleman
back.
has expired. Mr. Secretary, there may be a desire for some members of the subcommittee for a second round of questioning. Let me do a poll. How many want a second round? And on this, well, well, at least what we can do is limit the time. So the round will, your question, you'll have a 3-minute round, and let's try to move quickly because the Secretary, we're nearing his hard leave time. Does the Secretary wish a 5-minute break before we do the second round? Thank you. Mr. Secretary, 6 weeks ago, I took a Codell to, among other places, Egypt, and we were meeting with the president on Palm Sunday morning, 2 hours, when one of the church bombs went off near Cairo. But what a meeting, and what a leader that we saw there in El-Sisi. This was just after we had tomahawked in Syria. And he said something that really stayed with me. He said, in this part of the world, Middle East, he said, in this part of the world, what that signified was America's back. And he was quite pleased. We found the same reaction in Beirut and in Amman, of course. So the president had by all accounts, a very, very successful Middle East trip, which left a lot of enthusiasm in that region. So it seems like we're sort of on the cusp of something pretty good taking place. Can you feel that, and tell us about that?
Well, the president's trip to Riyadh in particular, and the sequence of the trip was quite deliberate, was to engage with the Saudis, obviously, as the leaders in the Arab world, as the custodian of the holy mosque of the Muslim faith, and to convene this Arab-Muslim summit. Every leader around the world of a major Muslim country was there, and to call upon them to take ownership for these extremist elements that are out there that they have to fix. He said, we can help you, but we can't do it for you. He was quite clear, and he's been very forceful in saying to them, the time has come. The time's come. You have to own this. You have to address it. That was the message in the GCC roundtable, which I attended with him. He then took it to the larger global Muslim Arab world. And it has clearly motivated a number of countries now, I think, to understand things have changed. And we're back in a different way. We're back in a very decisive way. We're back in a way that we have no more patience for this. We have no more patience for this. You have to begin to address this. Two tangible outcomes of the summit were the creation of the Center to Counter Muslim Extremism, which the Saudis they built. The building is there. The president participated in the ribbon cutting. 200 people working at computer terminals, monitoring social media, monitoring messaging, inserting ways into messaging. That was just the beginning. That center is going to take on a number of other challenges, ranging from textbooks that are distributed in mosque, which teach violence. This is from the old Wahhabism. They have already developed new textbooks to replace those. We said you not only have to distribute the new ones, you have to get the old ones back. We got to get them out of circulation. Extending all the way to how they begin to educate young imams through the great theological centers, that this message of violence will stop. And we are engaged with them about cutting off funding to terrorist organizations, but those who promote violence as well. So the second important outcome was the creation of the Center to Counter Terror Financing. We're marshaling Treasury resources here, intelligence resources. We're going to create a template on how to attack this with Saudi Arabia, an agreement, because there are some important agreements around intelligence sharing, how you actually use your own laws to get at these. When we have that template built and the Emiratis are ready to sign on, we're going to approach every GCC country, and then we want to develop a suitcase, I call it, that we can take to lesser developed countries in Africa, South America, Southeast Asia, because this problem is existing. The terror financing networks now encircle the globe, and we've got to cut off the funding. If we can cut the funding off to these organizations, they can't transport people around the world. They can't bribe officials to be able to move illicit equipment around the world. We can begin to really degrade this spread of violence. This is a long journey, but we're putting in place tools to get at the elements that allow this to continue to exist and allow it to continue to be transferred to other parts of the world. So these were important outcomes. Now we have to follow through and actually put them into action.
Well, it's exciting, and it's obvious we're on the verge of something big here, and we appreciate the thought that went into that, and then the execution of that plan. Ms. Lowy.
Thank you. On April 18th, you wrote to the Congress to certify that the conditions of the Iran Nuclear Agreement Review Act of 2015 were met as of that date. One sentence later, you referred to Iran's role as a leading state sponsor of terror and explained that the National Security Council will review the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action to evaluate whether the suspension of specific Iran sanctions pursuant to the JCPOA is vital to the national security interests of the U.S. With the influx of billions of dollars to Iran as a result of sanctions relief, what is the administration's strategy to combat Iran's non-nuclear destabilizing activities in the region, particularly Iran's funding of terrorist groups and supply of weapons? And what are we doing to prevent Iran from transferring advanced weaponry to non-state actors in the region who might use these weapons against our allies? And how are we confronting destabilizing Iranian action in Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, and Iraq? And if we had more time, or you can just add it to that, I'd like to know about Russia's efforts in that regard.
We have the Iran policy is under review currently. I think one of the, as I think about Iran in a whole of country approach, I think one of the unintended consequences of the JCPOA was that our relationship with Iran got defined by a very narrow slice of concerns, nuclear weapons. And as we spent all of our time focused on that, we completely ignored all of the other hegemonic activities that you've just described. We now approach the Iran policy with a whole of country approach, and we see the JCPOA as one small part of it. We are developing our policy toward Iran more broadly, and the JCPOA would just be a piece of it. And whether the continuance of the JCPOA is useful to our policy or whether it is counterproductive to our policy is part of this review. As you know, the JCPOA for compliance comes up every 90 days, which is followed by a waiver to the sanctions. So we're coming up on the next report. I can tell you the President does not like the JCPOA agreement. I don't like the JCPOA agreement. Iran's compliance, the compliance mechanisms under the agreement have a very low bar. It's not that hard for Iran to comply. And it ultimately does not solve the problem. I've characterized JCPOA as the same mistake we made in North Korea. We just booted it down the road for somebody else to deal with later. So we do believe we have to look at this as a whole of country strategy. You've seen us already issue additional sanctions for missile tests. We are developing policy in Syria, how they support Hezbollah, and their interference in Iraq's efforts to stay unified. those are all of the challenges in our policy which we're developing in terms of our responses, and we expect to have that concluded here relatively soon.
Thank you.
Thank you. First of all, let me say the change in the opinion of Iran in that agreement is very much appreciated. A lot of us were very concerned about that. You stated that we now think China sees North Korea as a liability. Can you tell me what changes or signs that you saw from China to become to that opinion, and what do you think China is willing to do?
Well, that is what we are working with the Chinese to have them realize. I don't want to suggest that they've come to the full conclusion, but I think it is clear that China now sees how destabilizing North Korea can be to the region. The last thing China wants is a war, another war in Korea. It will set their economic development back decades, and they know this. And so they have a huge incentive to not put us in a position to have to take military action to remove this threat. But the President has said that option's on the table, and he means it. Regrettably, the situation in North Korea has come to a point where we have no runway left. We cannot land this plane any longer. And for years and years, people kept saying, well, we'll get there, we'll get there. There's nothing left. They are there. So we have to reverse what North Korea is doing. And our approaches and our strategies, and some of this is done quietly, without a lot of visibility. That's the way we get things done. But China, I think, first, they have affirmed their policy is a denuclearized Korean Peninsula. We have been very clear to give China room and to give North Korea room as to what our policy is not trying to do. And I've articulated it at the UN and elsewhere. We do not seek regime change. We do not seek a collapse of the regime. We're not seeking an accelerated reunification. We're not seeking a reason to come north of the 38th parallel. We're seeking denuclearization. Fix that, and we're all great, and you'll be great. And China has indicated to us those four statements have been crucial to their ability to change their posture as well.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Starkey, I tell you, it's very hard for me to understand how you can support this, and I say Steve Bannon's budget, given your presentation today. This 29% cut just doesn't seem to be consistent with your responses. A couple of things. Cuba. I co-chair the Cuba Working Group. It's bipartisan, and even though there's disagreement with regard to normalizing relations with Cuba and allowing Americans to travel to Cuba, allowing business to do business, even though we do this with Vietnam, normal relations, Vietnam and China, Cuba is still, for the most part, embargoed. Yet I see in your budget, it allocates $24 million for this unnecessary and counterproductive radio and TV marquee. It's been well documented that these funds have been misused in the past and are essentially aimed, of course, we know at what it's doing, trying to undermine Cuban sovereignty and regime change. I would think that you would look at this and see other areas where it could be better utilized in terms of your overall mission of the State Department. Seen since 1945 in Yemen, South Sudan, Nigeria, and Somalia, now it's 30 million people facing starvation. An additional 50 million people are severely hungry. Yet you've cut $1 billion from international development assistance and eliminated the Title II food aid account. How do you justify these enormous cuts while millions of children are severely malnourished and depend on this critical funding for life-saving food and care?
With respect to Cuba, notwithstanding the change policy of the past administration and all of the benefits that we would acknowledge have come about because of that to Cuban citizens and to American citizens as well. As I said to someone in the hearing yesterday, that's the sunny side of that deal. The dark side of that deal is the Cuban government and the Cuban regime haven't changed their behavior or their treatment of people one bit. All the prisoners are still locked up. All the opposition gets locked up. The ladies in white still get harassed. And there is no more freedom in Cuba today than there was before this opening. So we have 4 statutes on the books that govern our relationship with Cuba and the blockade. Our view is we're supposed to follow and enforce the law. So our approach is not to undo as much as possible the beneficial aspects to the Cuban people, to give them a better life. We want that. But the law says we are not to be facilitating, or we're not allowing the financing or flow of monies to the regime. And that is occurring under some of the reopening arrangements. We have to address that. Now, if the Congress, if it's this body's view that we should change the relationship with Cuba, repeal those laws, change the blockade, we'll take the direction from the Congress on that. But that's not the current situation. So the administration intends to enforce those statutes that have been on the books a very long time.
And have not worked.
Mr. Diaz-Balart?
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Mr. Secretary, on China, I agree with you that you talked about how that regime is weaponizing trade. Just along with my colleague when she talked about North Korea, I just hope that we keep the pressure on, because I do think that China plays a long ball, a long game, and sometimes I think that they're playing with us. And so I just know that I've liked what I've heard from the president, but I just hope that we keep the pressure on. But let me just throw a couple of questions at you, because I keep hearing this thing about how we're pulling back. Now, we have some differences on your budget, and we'll work. So there's no reset.
No, you can't reset what is.
All right. The Jordanians, our allies.
We can't erase all that bad behavior.
All right. Okay, good. I appreciate that, because all of a sudden somehow, I hear all these things about pullback, but let's look about what happened a little while ago. Jordan, Morocco, our Middle Eastern allies, particularly Israel, I hear that they're very happy that this has changed, and now we're actually going to be confronting Iran with their terrorism, correct?
If there's one thing that unifies the area, it's the threat from Iran.
Would it
Very decisive. With our security, national security, our counterterrorism efforts, what we are willing to do, and the president's already demonstrated with 2 major actions.
I would agree with that. So I just want to make sure, because there's a lot of noise and there's a lot of static. So there is no pullback in leadership. On the contrary, there is resolve in leadership, is what I'm seeing. And I just want to make sure that I haven't misread something. Now, again, you and I will have disagreements on budgetary issues, and we will work through those, as clearly the chairman will. But what I'm seeing is leadership and leading from the front, not behind. I will tell you that some of us see that as highly refreshing. I yield back.
No, we are clearly leaning in to our role in the region and elsewhere, and having very difficult, frank, honest, tough conversations with our allies and friends. And yet, when you do this, it gets a little uncomfortable from time to time. And we're not going to agree on everything. And we don't have to agree on everything, but we have to agree on the priorities, and we have to agree on our common threats. And in that area, we're clearly aligned.
And again, it's important to know who your allies are and treat them as allies, and who your adversaries and enemies are, and confront them like that. And I like the fact that there I don't see any confusion, so I'm grateful for that, Mr. Secretary. Thank you for your service.
Mr. Ruppersberger?
Yeah, I know I have 2 quick questions. The first one, you mentioned you wanted to build up the military. I agree. I think we need balance when you build the military on the domestic side, too. But I think if you look at the real reason where our military has been the last 3 years, it's because of sequestration. And as a business person, and budgeting is about priorities, and you can't cut everything across the board. Every 4-star general, I know Chairman Granger will tell you that has come before us in the last 3 or 4 years on defensive approach, has said that sequestration has done more to hurt us than any other issue that we have to deal with. And I would hope that you would work with the Trump administration and with us and whatever to do away with this law that makes us weaker. The other thing, one of the most serious issues we're dealing with, we know the Russia-China threat, and you've talked about that. It's cyber attacks, cybersecurity, and yet they even cyber attack our fertilizer companies to get information. Now I know the Trump administration has now has an executive order establishing American Technology Council. Reed Cordish, who happens to be from my hometown, Baltimore, is coordinating that. And hopefully something has to be done on our first government network, which you're a part of in the State Department, but just generally the whole issue of cyber. And so wondering whether, first thing, whether you agree with me on the sequestration and you'll work with us on that, but on the cyber level, the State Department and being all over the world in which your mission is really susceptible to a lot of cyber issues. And where you are, what monies you need, and whether that's a high priority for you. Those are my two, and I'll stop.
I think all of us would agree sequestration is a blunt force instrument. It's not the way, I'm not an appropriator. I respect the role of the appropriators. It's not the way to run the railroads, and I think Secretary Mattis has spoken on that as well. With respect to cyber, quite frankly, I think this is one of our most daunting challenges for the government, for the private sector. We've created systems that have brought enormous prosperity, wealth, convenience, changed the way our lives work day in and day out, but we left a lot of doors open as those were being created. The government systems require significant attention. Some of it is hardware, some of it is software, a lot of it is what I call peopleware. And so until we can address the hardware, software, the systems itself, our best defense are our people. They have to recognize when an attack is underway. They have to they need to not open the door for someone. So I think I've looked at our cyber training at the State Department. I think it's lacking based on my private sector experience. And we have to help our people understand how vulnerable we are, and how big the mistake, as little as they may think it is when they click on something, how huge the consequences of that could be. So till we can address the bigger problem, we've got to rely on our people defending the systems.
That's a good point. I represent NSA, and you're right, we need younger.
Time of the gentleman has expired. We're really running short here. The Secretary has to leave very soon. Can you be brief?
One question.
Mr. Dent.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary, I have some concerns regarding the embassy security and the budget and in light of the overall budget cuts to state and USAID. While the actual funding level for embassy security was relatively similar to prior years, I'm concerned that the overall budget cuts are going to lead to cuts to the embassy security accounts, and I'd just like to hear your view on that. Thank you.
We've kind of looked back to 2016 because there were some additions, obviously in 17, some in the buildings part of the budget. If you look at DS, diplomatic security budgets, it's actually up 11% from 2016. As we look at the buildings and part of the embassies and facilities part of the budget, it also was up. We can continue our current program meeting our embassy and facilities needs certainly through 2018. The cut will begin to influence our planning going forward.
Thank you, Secretary. I'm very concerned about the processing of visas for foreign-born doctors who seek to practice medicine in the U.S. They account for about 14% of the residency matches in American hospitals every year, and they disproportionately serve rural and underserved communities. We've had reports from constituents that visa applications by these doctors this calendar year have been denied at historically high levels, and often many are being processed so slowly that these doctors lose their residency placements. My first question, can you commit to examining this issue and working together to ensure that qualified doctors' visas are processed in a timely fashion and that they are not being categorically denied so that our fellow Americans are able to receive the medical care they need here in the U.S.? My second question, I'll be quick. In your confirmation hearing, you said that study after study confirms that when you empower women in developing parts of the world, you change the future of the country, and I agree with you. An adolescent girl can't be empowered if she misses school due to lack of access to basic hygiene and sanitation needs. A woman who's fleeing a disaster still needs menstrual and reproductive health needs met if she is to focus on economic stability and security of her family. Your proposed budget, though, calls for slashing water and sanitation hygiene, or WASH, work performed by U.S. agencies as well as work performed by the UN in this area. How can we empower women to change the future of their countries if they don't have the basics to stay in school or participate in the economy due to immediate concerns they may have about water and sanitation needs?
With respect to the visas for doctors, I assume you're speaking to the J-1 visa program. I've taken a quick look at that, as well as taking a look at kind of how is visa issuance trending generally. I don't detect any change in the number of visa applications that have been rejected, through the adjudication process. It's running about a third, and that's what it has historically run, is about a third, as best I can tell. So I will look into it further, since you've asked, and we can be happy to get back to you.
Would love to work on this issue to make it more efficient.
Yeah, and this is, again, I don't detect that there's been any change in how we're handling that, but the whole visa, as you can probably appreciate, the whole visa process in consular affairs, we think is a big opportunity as well. So we want to attack that. On the women's issues, again, tough decisions we've had to make about where to curtail certain spending, work with others, see if we can bring other agencies in, bring others to the issue. We're not withdrawing from our the importance of the issue to us.
Mr. Fortenberry?
Secretary, quickly, can we return to one of the points I raised earlier with regards to interim zones of stability? You made the comment that as areas are being cleared, we're filling those in with an initial securitization effort and then allowing for governance structures to redevelop. I fear, though, that without a larger footprint in this regard, particularly in the Nineveh Plain area, we aren't going to create the long-term conditions for resecuritization as well as revitalization and repatriation of the ancient communities who once were housed in that area. So we've done considerable work thinking as well as putting down potential measure problems. So is there a way to continue to dialogue with you in this regard?
Well, most certainly, I would welcome the discussion. In terms of the whole stabilization, we're looking at stabilization of Iraq broadly when the de-ISIS campaign ends. We've got a number of issues there in terms of Iranian militias, some foreign fighters that need to go home. We're working with Prime Minister Abadi on how he's going to deal with Shia militia or groups that have been engaged in the fight, and they've been important to the fight. Kurdish forces that are important to the fight, been engaged in the fight. When all this is over, how do we secure Iraq? And that is going to involve us and working with Secretary of Defense Mattis over what is the security arrangement the U.S. is willing to undertake with the government of Iraq. What do they want in the way of our help to secure and create that stability so that these regions, much of this, they need to get back to the original Constitution. A lot of elements of the original Constitution were never implemented, which gave the opportunity for regional autonomy. That led to a lot of this conflict.
That's a good point.
So, yes, we'd be very happy and willing to engage.
Mr. Price?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Secretary, first a quick note on Egypt. I'm happy to hear your strong criticism of the anti-NGO law. You know that that law was actually sitting there. It was passed in Parliament last November. President Sisi reportedly hesitated to sign it because of strong international criticism, including people like Senators McCain and Graham. Recently, he signed the anti-NGO law, and most reports suggest that he did it encouraged by the embrace of President Trump. Now, what you're saying today is very much at odds with that. And so the question is, did Egypt misread U.S. intentions, and what should we do about it? Let me ask you about an appointment that the U.S. blocked at the United Nations and that still puzzles me and I think needs to be explained. This involved Salam Fayyad, who was nominated to be UN Special Representative to Libya. He had great qualifications. The Israeli ambassador to the U.S., Ron Dermer, has called him a peace partner, the first Palestinian who cared about the Palestinians. Nikki Haley made a puzzling statement, implying that somehow the appointment of Mr. Fayyad would be detrimental to Israel. So my question is, what in the world happened? Does the administration view the blocking of Salam Fayyad, a person who's arguably been probably the most constructive partner we've engaged with regards to Israeli-Palestinian peace, Does the administration regard that as a way to support Israel? Did the Israeli government ask for Salam Fayyad to be blocked? Was the blocking of Mr. Fayyad maybe linked to a possible UN appointment of Tzipi Livni? I mean, that was speculated about. Of course, she would also be a great asset to the UN. Was Mr. Fayyad denied simply because he's Palestinian, because of his nationality? As you know, one doesn't need to be a representative of a state to be appointed a UN representative. Is it the administration's position that support for Israel and support for the appointment of a well-qualified Palestinian to a post at the UN are mutually exclusive?
Well, first, with respect to President Sisi signing of the NGO bill, that, as I indicated, that was a big disappointment to us. There was no, to my knowledge, and I only was involved in some of the discussion between the President and President Sisi, there was no discussion that would in any way have encouraged him to sign that. So, and certainly we were not encouraging. In fact, we had indicated to them that he should not sign it. It came up in my bilateral with him. And I know that others in the national security advisors, they also asked that he not sign that. So why? We're in conversations with them now. I mean, they have received calls where we've told them, you know, what's going on? Why did you sign this? So it may have been a miscalculation on his part. I can't really tell you, but we have expressed our disappointment in that. On the second matter, I just have to be honest with you, I'm not that intimately familiar with it, but I will look into it and talk to Ambassador Haley as well and do a more thorough, and happy to get back to you with an answer.
I would appreciate you doing that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Secretary, in your statement this morning, you described the many involving challenges to U.S. national security and economic prosperity. You also said that we must develop proactive responses to protect and advance the interests of our country, and spoke of the importance of engagement with other nations on issues of security and prosperity. In the weeks ahead, the subcommittee will examine closely the President's budget request for fiscal 18, assess its impacts, recommend funds that enable us to achieve these shared goals. It's been a long couple of days for you to testify before these 4 subcommittees on the Hill. You've been very generous with your time and your attention and your thoughts and ideas, Ms. Secretary, and we were very appreciative of your appearance here and willingness to undergo this exam. So thank you for your service to the country. Good luck in this role. We're impressed with your knowledge of what you're doing. We want to be helpful, and we wish you well. Committee stands adjourned.
Susan.